Hi, Nancy Spears with Gen Connect You, and today I have been waiting on this call actually, or this conversation with Kathy Allen for weeks because she is one of our most popular authors when it comes to the subject of leadership, because her view on leadership and her life study on leadership is it's really unbelievable in terms of just a different viewpoint, because she looks at leadership from a living system point of view. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kathy, or Kathleen Allen. Hi, Kathy, how are you?
I am wonderful. Thanks, Nancy. Great to see you today.
Great to see you as well. So Kathy has a blog that's global, and I was asking her before we got on the chat, we're seeing so much international response to her courses. She has two courses with us on Gen Connect. The first one was Leading from the Roots, and where we really just got into the basics of her studies. And then there was so much to tap into her wisdom about that we asked her to please do another course with us. And so she just published a course with us called How to Lead with a Living Systems Framework. And we are seeing purchases from around the world, in the Netherlands, Sweden, South Africa, Australia. It's just fantastic. So, Kathy, you actually have a blog that goes global.
Yes, apparently. It's pretty nice. It's fun to know that you're speaking to lots of different pockets in the world.
And what do you think provokes that? Is it a paradigm shift towards the value of the climate finally, that people are waking up around how important it really truly is?
It's hard to understand fully what attracts people, but in nature, everything is based on attraction. It's not based on push. And so that's kind of how I think about my ideas, is that I'm putting them out there and creating a way to talk about them that attracts attention and time and experimentation. And so what we're finding is that apparently the attraction isn't limited to one geographic region, but there are people that are being attracted from lots of different places around the world. So to me, it tells me that people are seeking another way. They're thinking there's got to be another way than the way we've been running organizations all this time. And when you speak with a different voice, and my voice in particular is informed by nature, and most people have some direct experience with it. So it is a way to help us reimagine organizations and organizational leadership.
Brilliant. What provoked you to, or what was the aha moment that enabled you to connect the dots of leadership with your study of nature?
I've been reflecting on this because sometimes this is a fairly typical question that I get, and I think it actually goes back to being a kid and loving being outside, and then having two parents. One, my mom was a wonderful gardener, and so she always enlisted her kids to help in the garden. And then my dad was a business owner, entrepreneur, and he was really great at developing people. So for some reason, growing things in the garden and developing people came together for me. And then as I built my career, I just realized that how these ideas that of being more connected to nature could apply to be more connected in our workplaces and more relational. And that worked for me professionally in my higher ed career, and it worked significantly with my clients in nonprofits and foundations and startups and growing businesses and entrepreneurs. So all of those, they were all seeking another way to think about leadership. That's the common theme, and they all found me for some reason or other to help them do that, to invent a different way to lead in their organizations.
Well, I think what you said earlier on just the expanded awareness that people are looking for a new way to lead. Obviously, a lot of the systems in the world are broken right now. And so maybe that has ignited a search for a new way to lead. Can you give us some examples
Yeah.
of how nature informs us in a new way to lead?
Well, the shift from thinking of our organizations and the people in them as objects or machines to seeing our people as human beings, alive, living, breathing, creating, self-organizing, purpose-driven, having a degree of sovereignty. Uh, those things are antithetical to the structures and systems that we've built up in our organizations. Most of our organizations came into being when we were falling in love with machines. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to us that we created our organizations in more mechanistic like frameworks. So we built HR processes that were about control and direction and typical top-down leadership, which is actually the kind of serial connections that machines use. If you press this button, the engine will turn on or whatever, right? So we recreated our organizations in that light. But we also had problems that happened from that kind of choice. We can't get people to authentically engage. We can't get them to give us their all of their creative energies. We struggle with innovation and creating innovative cultures within our organizations. What we don't understand is that it goes back to how we're thinking about the organization in the first place, which is when you think about an organization as a machine, organizations don't innovate, they don't evolve, they don't self-organize, they don't create, they don't engage. And but living systems do all the time. So when we shift to a living system, what we get is a totally different organizational culture, and it's a culture that we need and we're striving for, because our world's becoming more complex and dynamic. And if our organizations can't adapt to that, then we're in trouble. As the last 2 years of the pandemic has reminded us, adaptation is the thing that will help us thrive and survive these kind of major disruptions that are going on.
So it's fascinating. So do you, because you work with all different sizes of companies, and would you find with a larger company trying to infuse that empathetic viewpoint in order to ignite the change, would they have a concern around productivity, for example?
Yeah, so the idea in a mechanistic organization is productivity is actually enhanced with control. But nature, a system of 3.8 billion years of R&D, has been extraordinarily regenerative and productive without command and control. So how do we? The reason why I love to use nature as kind of a model and a muse to think about and rethink about leadership in organizations is that it helps me see how so many of the defaults that I grew up with and thinking about how to lead organizations really don't achieve what we're hoping to achieve. So the question is not necessarily could we be more productive or less productive. The question to me is, would it take less energy, time, and supervision to unleash talent instead of controlling talent? And I believe the answer would be yes. And so when you go ahead.
No, please continue.
And so so when you start thinking about living systems, your leadership questions change. You shift from who's going to make this work to living systems are interdependent. So it's really about more what interactions will help make this work. Instead of what do I need to control, you're asking what do I need to unleash, because living systems self-organize. We're so used to thinking that people need direction to be productive. But in nature, everything self-organizes. A blade of grass self-organizes. Ants self-organizes. Bees, birds, whales. I mean, everything has this ability to be self-directed. But we have systems in our organizations that continue to hinder this self-organization at work. So people self-organize all the time. They self-organize when they think about what they're going to do for fun on the weekends. They self-organize about taking their kids to the grocery store. They self-organize on outings, friendships, conversations, organizing your DIY project, whatever. But at work, we have a lot of systems that actually are hindering our ability to unleash this self-organization, this huge resource that we have in our systems. So let me give you an example. I've been trying to help people understand the difference between living systems and machines. And I've been thinking, going back to my roots of gardening, and how um, when you garden, you prepare the soil. You're creating conditions that you hope the seeds will take root in. And then you plant the seeds. You select the seeds and you plant the seeds. But the seeds self-germinate. They germinate on your own. So you're not out there in the garden supervising whether the seeds are growing or not. And then eventually a shoot comes up, and your question is, what resources and nutrients, rain or whatever I need to help this little green shoot that's coming up to grow, expand, eventually bloom, and eventually get pollinated, and eventually bear fruit, and then do it all again the following year, right? So that is a relationship to a living system. Gardening, we think that we're supposed to drive change down through our organizations, but nature and gardening would suggest that maybe we should be thinking about growing change in this beautiful garden that we have called a living system in our organization.
Yeah, and I want to let the audience know that the course is just chocker full of this beautiful imagery, along with graphics that are make it so implicit in terms of what your study is and what your teachings are and what the results can be. So I do encourage people to look at that, because it really, I just love it. But so you talk about this, it's not just a free for all. I mean, there is sensibility behind it. How do you, when you're working with a company and you're talking about, doing things a different way, unleashing, as you call it, creativity, empathy, how would you still help a company, or how would nature inform a company on how to align, so that it's organized, it's just not chaotic
Mhm.
with the shift?
Yeah, so this is another beautiful shift between machines or mechanistic frameworks and living system frameworks. So in a mechanistic framework, the way we align is literally by lining up all of the bolts and the nuts and the screws and the systems. So we have leverage points in the system. But in nature, it's a very dynamic, complex, interdependent system, just like the rest of the world is right now. So it's not like we're going to go back to a more simplistic time. And in nature, alignment is actually driven on two frameworks. One is it's driven on a very powerful purpose. So in nature, that purpose would be to create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. How beautiful is that? And then it uses self-organization to basically unleash self-organization in service of that purpose. And that's what's powerful in nature in the design. And then the third thing it does, it creates all of these feedback loops till you know whether you're aligned with purpose or not. And the feedback loops either reinforce the direction that you're going, or they dampen it down in some way, shape, or form. So in nature, it's a very light kind of supervisory frame. There's not a CEO and a board hanging out trying to figure out how to make sure nature's working and is aligned and on task. Nature is a regenerative system, and it has regenerated 5 times from 5 mass extinctions. Life is still here, so it's successful in its design. We as organizational leaders would love to have organizations that were able to regenerate themselves. We're able to innovate and adapt and continue to thrive 100 years from now. But our leadership structure and thinking of organizations as non-living systems hinder those aspirations. But if we shift to a living system, then we look to nature because it's the longest running regenerative system we have to learn from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You talked during that, you touched on interdependence. And I would say all of us have experienced interdependence globally in the past 2 or 3 years with the pandemic and now the war than we ever have experienced interdependence before, and certainly empathy through that interdependence. So with regard to an organization, how can you design a company that's interdependent as opposed to top to bottom?
Yeah, so first of all, we already have interdependence in our organizations. And if we can't see it, it's because we're not noticing. When we invited technology into our organizations, technology created this networked relationship that bypassed the hierarchy. So when we created organizations in the early 1900s, we created these top-down hierarchical systems. But when technology really became pervasive and ubiquitous in our organizations, what we didn't understand was it was reinforcing the humanness of our organizations because it also created this network of connections and relationships that could operate parallel to the hierarchy. So we already have interdependence, but what we don't understand is how interdependence shapes or should shape the way we think and lead. For example, when we think that leadership is about getting stuff done, what we don't understand is that networks actually thrive on relationships. And if you're not in relationship in a network, you basically can't share information down along those relationships. You can't leverage the quality of your relationships to bring new ideas and new ways of thinking, new identities to the organization and to the work. So information, relationships, and identity all go hand in hand. And if you aren't in relationship with people, you're in trouble because you're not going to evolve.
Mm-hmm.
So we have interdependence. Interdependence is really organized through relationships, aided by technology, but anchored in the people. And when we begin to think in interdependence, what we realize is that we start asking the question, how are my actions impacting the situation, the problem that I'm trying to solve? Because these two things are interdependent, they're not separate. Traditionally, when we don't think in an interdependent way, we think, oh, these other people, these other people just changed, then we'd be okay. And we never go back and say, oh, I'm connected to this system. How are my actions disrupting this problem or adding to the problem that I'm trying to solve? And then the other way interdependence frames things up for us is that what we don't understand is we have interdependence over time as well. So the way we have solved problems in the past become the agenda of our problems in the present. And the way we're solving problems in the present will create our agenda of problems and challenges and opportunities for the future. And if anything's shown this, climate change has shown this to be beautifully true, but it's very practical and concrete. If you can figure out how your actions in the past have dismissed or disrupted trust in your organization, you know that the problems that you're trying to solve today are going to be affected by the absence of trust because of the choices of past leaders. I've got a client who loves to think about their organizations in 100-year time sequences. So the leaders of this organization, which is both a network and a top-down organization, they like to think of themselves not as just individual collection of leaders leading the organization, but they think about their actions today and how their actions today will create a stronger organization tomorrow or 50 years from now or 100 years from now. And their purpose is to ensure that their organization thrives 100 years from now. How beautiful is that? So their identity as a leadership team is actually part of a leadership relay race. So they've been handed the baton from previous generations of leadership in this organization. And it's there today. They are carrying the baton today. And they want to pass off the baton to the next generation of leaders for this organization in a way that the organization is well positioned and is better off, has the resources, has the the reserves, has to create opportunities so that they will take the organization and help it continue to evolve. This is a very foreign kind of way of thinking about organizational leaders. Family-owned businesses, they start having those frameworks, but they don't always know, how to make it so. But my framework is that if we started seeing our organizations as a living entity, we would realize that we're in a relationship. It's the third element in the room between me and a person that I'm leading. There's also the living system. I used to sail, and when you sail a small boat, which is what I was into, you have no engine, and so you're always in relationship to the wind, the direction of the wind, the waves, where you want to go, the boat, the way the boat is designed to leverage wind and move, your own skill as a sailor. And all of those things have you kind of seen the system as somebody that you're in a dance with, not something that you can control. And I think leading in living systems has that similar kind of frame. You're bringing your skills, the design of your system, your organization, but you're also acknowledging the external forces that are shaping the organization and the internal forces and the relationships of your organization. And you're using all of that to help you achieve what you're trying to achieve. It's a different way of thinking about it. I just wrote a blog on this, on what comes first, the chicken or the bee. The chickens, most of our organizations, if they realize that we're working with living entities, human beings, they treat them like chickens. They create a little cage, they create a roost, they feed them, they protect them from predators, and they have conversations in the morning about how productive they were the night before or the day before when they're sitting there eating their eggs. But bees have a different kind of element of sovereignty to them. They need to be attracted to pollinate your orchard or your flowers. In nature, flowers have pheromones and shapes and colors that are all designed to attract this independent, sovereign framework bees to do what will help them survive the next, generation or iteration of their flowers. So we need to start thinking about what leadership looks like based on attraction instead of control. That would be a living system question. And most of our management literature is still very deeply steeped in control. And then we wonder why people don't engage. It's just an interesting, you know,
I mean, the way you describe it, first of all, it makes such perfect common sense. Second of all, beautiful imagery that really everyone can connect with. Um, and I love the 100-year analogy that one client of yours is doing, because when you look at technology companies today, the biggest companies, well, Facebook, for example, is just over 10 years old. And if you look at how it would behave if it was a living system 90 years from now, breaking
right.
it down. And of course, then there is that rub between, being in a space of technology, but infusing the empathy as a human being so that you're operating more interdependently, like you say.
I think, COP26, the Business Roundtable, in 2019,
Mhm.
expanded their definition of stakeholders from stock people who bought their stock, shareholders, to employees, to the planet, to the communities that they're doing business in. This is, we're kind of in fits and starts moving in that direction because that direction acknowledges the interdependence of the system. So now the climate change, as it becomes more and more intense, and the impacts are not going to diminish. They're only going to, the feedback we're getting from nature is only increasing in its intensity. We're in the business where we need to expand from financial success as our primary measure of accountability to a financial accountability for success or measure of success to something that is more about impact and how do our choices and decisions impact future generations. So in an interesting kind of way, we're heading in the same direction that nature has always framed for us, which is how do we create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. And we're starting to ask that question in small pockets of the world that help and it's starting to inform our leadership. And I think, in paradigm shifts, the people who are last to shift are the ones that have been wildly successful in the old paradigm. And so if you look at what's going on globally, this kind of pushback around climate change is actually about that dynamic. It's about people who have succeeded financially and individually in a world that didn't see interdependence, didn't see that our choices, our decisions, our companies' decisions would and do have an impact on the livability of various parts of the world. So they are actually making decisions that will make parts of the world unlivable. That's what's going on today. And they're holding tight because they've been wildly successful and their bank accounts are full. But their kids, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren will have a life that's less viable, less regenerative, less thriving and thrivable than because of their choices today, because that's what we inherit in an interdependent system. So when we start thinking in living systems, those are the questions that start showing up to us in much sharper relief.
Well, that really truly hits home and sharpens the entire edge of responsibility around leadership, regardless of the size of the organization. So sadly, we're almost out of time. If you could leave us with one, I know it's a full garden, Kathy, but if you could leave us with one, take home message on how to learn from your system metaphors for how to lead um, an organization of any size, that would be fantastic.
My history is when I run into a difficult problem and my current literature that I'm reading to help inform my practice doesn't help me. I go outside of the field. And my outside of the field in the last 20 years has been nature, biomimicry. And I would, so we can't actually solve the problems that we're facing with the literature that we think is the literature of our field anymore. So we have to look farther. When my organizations wanted to create more integrated leadership teams and integrated organizations, our business leadership 20 years ago didn't really talk in integrated teams. They still talked in silos. So I went to the sustainability leadership literature because they were the ones that were talking about interdependence. And then I used those ideas to experiment to try to figure out another way of leading in organizations. So but here are a few small places that you could start. One is you could You could go for a walk in nature, and this time with the intent not to exercise, but to see the sheer um, aliveness, the wondrous aliveness of the system. And then ask yourself the question, how is this aliveness? How can I notice this same aliveness in my organizations? You can also um, look at the you can look at your relationships in your organizations. For years, I thought that my whole value to the organization was my productivity. And so when getting stuff done um, was, uh, there was pressure to get stuff done against maintaining relationships, I would always drop the relationships in the effort to get stuff done, to be productive. So one thing we could do personally would be to value relationships as the critical element to getting things done, and then start building those relationships. So assess how your relationships are at work, and then say, how can I make them stronger? How can I make them more authentic? How can I make our collaboration and cooperation more powerful?
Well, those are great tips for not just companies, but life in general. And one of the questions that came through was actually a statement, which I think we should close the session with that because it's so great. And then we're all going to take a walk and really digest this conversation. But a gentleman, Martin Murphy, says, as usual, Kathy is both profoundly insightful and incisive.
Mm.
So,
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, good friend. Relationship wealth, Penny, right? Penny Ellis just put that in. I love the relational wealth. You know, we have to start seeing the wholeness of our system. Every
mhm,
time we prioritize a part, the system becomes weaker.
mhm.
Every time we make decisions based in the whole, our systems become more sustainable, regenerative, and powerful in a creating conditions conducive to future generations kind of way.
Well, I have total optimism because when we have people like you in the world to keep us, in alignment and to really understand what's important and just to be aware, uh,
Hmm.
um, there's hope. So
Yeah,
I'm so grateful for you.
there are reasons to hope. I think a whole bunch of people, millions of people around the world, intuitively lead this way already. They just
Yeah.
don't have the language for it. And so my work, my voice, my perspective is really just giving them language to understand why their work is so impactful and powerful, and reinforce that what they're doing in that their intuition is telling them to do in organizations matters, and it is making our world better.
Well, I can't thank you enough, not only for the session today, but for all the work and for doing the courses with us, of course, but more just in general for the massive impact you're making in the world and in corporate America. So,
Mhm. Thank you
um,
very much.
thanks
It's
again. Thanks.
wonderful to
Thanks.
be here. All right.
All right. All right. Take care.